is a whole web of activities, including sex trafficking, child sexual abuse, blackmail, extortion, money laundering, political corruption, police complicity, influence peddling, cover-ups, financial fraud, and the list goes on. And in fact, we've barely scratched the surface of this scandal. First, because we're talking about 3.5 million of pages of documents that have been released. And everything suggests that there's a huge number of documents that are being withheld from the public. But let's consider just what we have now. If we were to print and stack the 3.5 million of documents, the pages of the files, they would be taller than the Eiffel Tower. So in short, we barely understand what's in it at this point. And I think this scandal is like a nuclear accident. If you watch the series Chernobyl, you know that there's something very special about a nuclear accident. It's like an invisible time bomb whose devastating effect would take a long time to become apparent. But despite all of that, we've already seen devastating consequences. Political figures are being exposed in Europe, like Peter Mandelson in Britain and Jack Lang in France. Of course, we have the man formerly known as Prince Andrew, the disgusting Randy Andy, who's been arrested by the police. It's the first time a member of the royal family has been arrested since Charles I, and I think we all know how it ended. Now, we can spend, I think, all day discussing, the details of the files, can discuss about Epstein's life and his mysterious death, could talk about his island, his famous Lolita airplane, can talk about all his very naive friends, from Chomsky to Clinton. But the thing is that we don't have all day. And I think for communists, the most important thing about all of this is the effect it is having and is going to have on the minds of millions of workers all around the world who are questioning themselves at this very moment. If this is what we know, what about what we don't know yet and we may never know? It's all about Epstein and his webs at the moment. But what about the other Epsteins in this world? Can we trust any politician at this point? Any billionaire? And we've already seen the impact on Trump himself, who is losing support from his MAGA base. A poll in March found that a majority of Americans, 52%, believe that Trump plunged the world into this utterly catastrophic war with Iran to distract from the Epstein's files. But it's not just Trump, it's the entire ruling class in the United States and beyond that is being discredited. It is quite amazing, people are talking about the Epstein class. And who are these people, this Epstein class? We see it now. They're despicable people who are above the law and yet impose the law on us, who exploit workers they deeply despise, and have no problem with pedophilia when they're not actually doing it, and have no problem with the sexual abuse of working class women, and they generally act with impunity. And also these people, they know each other, even across political affiliation and national borders. It's an international phenomenon. And in effect, what we have with the Epstein scandal is that the capitalist class is now being not only unmasked, but even personified. People see them for what they are. And in general, I think you can increasingly sense, this mood, this vibe where people are saying, they're all the same kind of people. Even those who are not in the files, we don't trust them. They have all the same mentality. Or they must have. And in the recent years, in the context of an historical crisis of capitalism, which bring an obscene wealth for an extremely small minority, and suffering and inhumane misery for broad layers of the working class, in this context, we've already seen enormous skepticism and cynicism towards the establishment and the institution of capitalism. The media, the politicians, the police, the courts, the church. And now all of this has played a major role in the recent waves of revolution we've seen in the years across the world. But now I think we're really adding a good dose of moral revulsion to all of that. In the Epstein files, the Epstein scandal is clearly the biggest scandal in history of US capitalism. Certainly one of the biggest scandals of capitalism as a whole, which brings to light what Marxists have long been explaining, that they are their morals and ours. Bourgeois morality is in a deep crisis right now. And I think when the working class realizes that the bourgeoisie does not abide by its own rule, that it is full of hypocrisy and crime, well, it won't be long before the workers, in turn, decide to refuse to obey the political and moral rules that have been imposed on them. The French revolutionary Robespierre once said, "It is when all laws are violated, it is when despotism is at its peak, it is when good faith and public morality are trampled underfoot, that the people must revolt." And I really think we're entering in an epoch in which millions of ordinary people all over the world will come to this conclusion, that we need to overthrow the Epstein class. Because the fact is that the question of morality plays an important role in the class struggle. So I propose that we explore this question today. I think we should start with a basic question. What is morality? In general, morality can be defined by a set of rules or precepts governing human action. We're commonly told in school or in church, for those who went to church, that morality is absolute. It's detached from history. It is the same for all individuals, regardless of time and space. But Marxists, we reject that conception because morality, as everything in life, is something very concrete and absolutely not static. Fundamentally, it is a material question. And like everything else, morality changes, evolves, as our living conditions change and society evolves. What is considered immoral today has not always been so. There's many examples of this. I'll just take one. I think it's not very controversial today to say that around the world, the killing of babies is an horrific moral crime. But if we take a giant leap back in time, thousands and thousands of years ago, all evidence suggests that infanticide, the killing of babies, of a child, was an acceptable practice under many hunter-gatherer society. It's not a matter of preference or opinion between different eras and cultures. It's not that by chance, we think that babies are way more cuter today than before. Although yes, babies are cute. It's not simply that, so it's not that. It's those moral conceptions, in fact, reflect the changes in the material development of society. In mobile hunter-gatherer societies, having too many dependent children reduced the tribe's productivity and increased the number of mouths to feed. And so under certain conditions, this became a significant burden and could pose an existential threat to the entire community. So the practice of infanticide thus reflected the brutally harsh conditions of life at a time when the level of development of the productive forces was very low. But as we know, the productive forces will develop, and eventually societies will be able to produce a surplus that will allow them to feed more people, including dependent children, and this will have an influence on morality. I think this illustrates what Trotsky explained, that morality is a product of social development. But let's be even more concrete here. What is the social development? How does society evolve? It evolves through class struggle. So morality reflects the class struggle. You may be familiar with, the powerful line from Marx and Engels in the German ideology. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The ruling class could not maintain its power over the majority of society by, solely relying on brute force. It needs other means. It needs ideological means to maintain its power. And morality is a key factor in this. You can say it is a tool in the hands of the ruling class to assert and reinforce its power. One of the most common moral rules that seems, timeless is the rule against stealing. It's in the Bible's 10 commandments, you shall not steal. And even today it's presented as, coming from an eternal authority that transcends society. But for most of human history, as we discussed in this session on historical materialism, there was neither private property nor inequality of wealth. Therefore, the very concept of theft or stealing, it didn't have any meaning and didn't make any sense. I mentioned the creation of a surplus and production. So what we'll see is that with the development of agriculture about 12,000 years ago, and the growing capacity to develop a surplus, certain
With water.
individual will be able to privately appropriate these surpluses, and this will provide the material basis for the emergence of inequalities of private property, and consequently the division of society into antagonist class. And from there, the ruling class will forge a state apparatus with detachments of armed men to protect the property of the wealthy, and it will monopolize ideological institutions such as religion. And with that, new social relations based on the exploitation of the majority by the minority will be reflected in a new morality that suited the ruling class. And one thing to add to that is that in turn, this will create the condition for a constant rise of so-called immoral behaviors as theft, because they mostly result from the objective contradiction of class society, such as social inequalities that push poor people to steal, for example. So today, the rule against stealing and the defense of private property are still presented as universal principles. It is so universal that guess what? Even Gemini, Google's AI, believes in it wholeheartedly. So I'm not making this up. By pure chance, I typed "you shall not steal" on Google, and Gemini replied to me. It was the first thing that appeared. They said, "I absolutely agree. Stealing is a serious ethical boundary." So they got my attention there. So I asked why they thought that. And they told me, "I agree with this principle because respecting the property of others is essential for living in a society." And listen to that. "Even though I am an artificial intelligence with neither consciousness nor possessions, I am programmed to value ethical behaviors that protect the community." I'm wondering which community needs protection these days. And on the other end, I started to question his moral, beliefs. So in the other end, they didn't wanted to tell me whether they thought that the rich were getting too rich out of a concern for neutrality. This is just an anecdote. But you see, morality is the battleground in a class struggle, and the capitalists are very careful about it. Now, if we talk about morality, we need to talk also about hypocrisy. For as long as society has been split into classes, they have gone end and end. This can be explained by the fact that official morality under class society, while being presented as applicable to everyone at all time, in reality it merely serves to justify and perpetuate the existing social relations for the benefit of the ruling class. It serves to unify class antagonism, or unify the antagonist class, rather, and blur the class struggle. It maintains the illusion of social harmony, of social unity. So, if it is a tool for the ruling class, it means that they don't really care about it. And that's where the hypocrisy comes in. Because the ruling class never really respects its own moral code. Or if they respect it, they will abandon it without fail if their vital interests are threatened. For example, in feudal Europe, the Catholic Church preached the utmost submission, humility, loyalty, and generosity. They preached that to the people, but did not hesitate to massacre the entire cities if they succumb to the so-called heresy. And today the same, the Epstein class, the same class that sows war and misery in every corner of the world, they also preach, wonderful humanitarian and even Christian values. They even quote the Bible sometimes. It's never as good as when Alan Woods does it, of course. But I think one question arises from all of this. If throughout history of the class struggle, morality has been a tool for the ruling class, which doesn't even abide by its own rule, how is it that the dominant morality is accepted by the oppressed masses? And I think for that, we must examine, the dynamic of class society. When the ruling class of a given society drives forwards and develops the means of production, society is in a relative state, a stable state. And the rule of the ruling class just seems, to make sense, even to the oppressed. So consequently, its moral order will also seem, to make sense. And, it appears, as a necessary protection to prevent society from, descending into brutal instincts. And so that is why the morality of the church served as a social pillar of feudalism for a long time. And, for a while, when members of the society, failed to follow the rules, it was seen as, individual crimes committed by what we would call, bad apples, rather than seen as a systematic problem. But eventually things change. And when a mode of production fails to develop, the productive forces as it once did, the social system it supports enters into a period of, historical crisis. And at that point, the ruling class becomes increasingly unable to maintain its rule as before. More and more, its entire social order loses its meaning, and with it, the moral order no longer makes sense for people. And eventually, society will transition into a new social system. We saw this with the collapse of the slave society in Rome. In the very last period of the Roman Empire, there was a sort of moral disintegration amongst the ruling class mainly. You had ruthless emperors who did not hesitate to carry on, mass execution. And they were, completely out of touch with the rest of society, full of corruption, acting in a complete impunity. Seems very familiar. So in all matters of depravity will become part of public life. And, it's not a coincidence that in this period, at the end of the 3rd century, millions of people throughout the Roman Empire, they turned to Christianity. They were looking for a new set of values that would make sense. If you ever read, the Gospels in particular, there's good passages about announcing the hypocrisy of the elite. And in many ways, we see the same depravity, the same opulence from the ruling class today, completely out of touch with society. We have the weird, pathetic buffoons like Elon Musk and the sick perverts like Epstein. Decaying societies brings decaying morality and create this elite of increasingly depraved individuals. It's really interesting to, look into the psychology of those people. I think we can say that their psychology is shaped by the fact that they are a parasitic class. They are parasites. They're no longer capable of bringing society forwards. They only bring more misery, alienation, inequalities, and violence in this world. And to a certain extent, we can even talk here about amorality, simply the rejection of moral principles. Maybe that rings a bell to you. We saw this in the period of the Renaissance. Probably know Machiavelli, who has been associated with amorality. And that's very interesting because Trotsky once drew parallels between Machiavelli's period and the one in which he himself lived. And I think we can say the same for our epoch as well. You know, Machiavelli lived in a time of intense class struggle in the 15th and 16th century in the Renaissance in Europe. It was essentially a period of transition between the dying feudalism and the bourgeois society that was being born. And you know, Machiavelli is often portrayed as this amoral schemer because the struggle for power for him was like, you know, a game of chess, you know, devoid of moral content. It's just pure, you know, pions and, you know, strategical behaviors. But in reality, he didn't invent something new. He was basing himself out of the actions of the ruling class of his time, including the Pope. I can mug the Pope in the church. I'm technically a Catholic, so I have my credentials. And so by doing so, you know, Machiavelli was exposing them to the public, which is why his, you know, his most famous work, The Prince, was banned by the Vatican. And he was not alone exposing this at the time. Pretty much at the same epoch, you had Martin Luther, who was protesting against the hypocrisy and the corruption of the church and its obscene accumulation of wealth. And as you know, he was laying the grounds for the Reformation and the rise of the Protestant church. And the Reformation would lead to a new moral outlook involving a more direct, a more personal relationship with the Word of God without unnecessary intermediaries. But of course, it didn't just come out of the sky, out of God, I guess. No. It was in line with the material interests of, you know, the rising bourgeoisie at the time, which was fighting against the feudal order and the power of the church. You know, and through the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment period, we'll see a very profound and important struggle for ideas, and with a new morality, you know, that was about to emerge. All of this as the new capitalist society was taking shape materially. And with the various bourgeois revolution of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, you know, yes, you had a struggle for, you know, a new social economic system, but it would often take the form, you know, of a struggle for a new morality. And the moral revulsion and the desire for a new moral order, it played a really important role in mobilizing the masses. And one thing that I think is important is that with this moral revulsion also comes something very powerful. And I would call a good dose of moral intransigeance, you know, revolutionary intransigeance. And the Great French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, at a certain point, it became very clear that the peasantry and the poor masses would not tolerate any bullshit anymore. They will no longer pay taxes, they will no longer accept any rules, any dictate, and trust me, they didn't. Enough was enough. No, quantity has been transformed into quality. And that was the spirit embodied by the revolutionary terror. But now, you know, I've been describing this process, historical development, but what about morality under capitalism? What about bourgeois morality? Well, when the bourgeoisie supplanted the aristocracy and became, you know, the ruling class, so we saw that the discredited feudal values of the past were replaced by, you know, the supposedly universal reign of liberty and equality before the law. But you know, this abstract and universal freedom masked the very concrete interests of the bourgeoisie, which needed freedom of trade and free markets, and also they needed free workers, you know, were free to sell their labor power. So, you know, the new social relations were inevitably reflected in this new bourgeois morality. And it was in this context where we're gonna see, you know, various bourgeois thinkers, philosophers, attempted to rationalize morality and remove the religious aspect of the past. You may be familiar with what are probably the two best examples of this, which are sometimes studied in school. On one side, the moral philosophy of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and the utilitarianism, I practice this word, of the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Both thinkers were from the second half of the 18th century. And Kant developed a morality based on duty, with this famous principle, the categorical imperative, which tells us that for an action to be morally good, we must ask ourselves whether our maxim of action can become a universal law. That's easier than it sounds, less complex. It means that before doing something, I have to ask myself, what would happen if everyone did the same thing as me? Would it be good or bad? And for example, for Kant, a world where everyone lies would be bad. Therefore, no one should ever lie, without exception, even if your life depends on it. This is ridiculous. I don't think I have to explain, but no one can follow such principle. I probably already have lied since the beginning of the lead-off. I don't know. So that's for Kant. On the other hand, we have Bentham's utilitarian morality, which focuses on the consequences of an action. Contrary to Kant, it's the idea that the ends justify the mean. It seems more reasonable from our perspective. And according to this theory, morality must be based on the pursuit of the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. I think at this point, everyone knows the famous trolley problem, trolley dilemma. You probably have seen memes about it, or maybe not. I don't know. It's the idea that you are driving a train which is heading on a track where 5 people are tied. If you do nothing, they will be killed. But you can decide to switch the train on another track where there's 1 person tied. But if you do so, you're now responsible for consciously killing someone. Kant would say, it's easy. You cannot kill people. If everybody was to kill people, it would be bad. So don't kill the man. Let the 5 people die. And for the utilitarian, that's very simple. You save the 5 people and you kill the other man. Greatest happiness for the greatest number. But now, the problem with both approach, the categorical imperative, the utilitarianism, is that it's based on the same abstract approach. They merely rationalize and universalize the natural morality of the bourgeoisie. And both lead to the same hypocrisy that is characteristic of the bourgeois morality. And in practice, you see the ruling class, they conjugate both of those approaches. Obviously, they never quote Kant, they don't talk about it. But they rely on the same logic as Kant when they say, for example, very seriously, that violence must never be used in politics, even though they violate this principle on a daily basis. And on the other hand, they often resort to utilitarian arguments to defend, I would say, pretty much anything and nothing. To justify imperialist wars or to justify imposing austerity measures, they'll say, yeah, people will suffer, but ultimately, it's for the greatest good and of everyone, because peace and prosperity will prevail. As Lord Farquaad in Shrek would say, some of you may die, but that is a sacrifice I'm willing to make. And from a theoretical standpoint, we could say that the utilitarian approach stops precisely where the reflection must begin. Because the real question is what actually maximizes the happiness of the greater number of people? And also, how can this be achieved in practice? As Trotsky noted, and I quote, "A means can be justified only by its end, but the end in its turn needs to be justified." So with this theory, you end up in a situation, for example, of a civil war, where one side may defend revolutionary violence by arguing that it protects the revolution, that it will lead, in fact, to greater happiness. But the other side may defend counter-revolutionary violence by arguing that it is a preservation of private property that will guarantee collective happiness. And so from an utilitarian perspective, both arguments are equal, This theory hasn't allowed us to decide between them. So it is really a dead end, I would say. So this is for bourgeois morality. There's a lot more to be said. But now, of course, what about Marxism? What do we stand for? What is considered moral for revolutionary communists? And contrary to the abstract idealist bourgeois morality, Marxism is based on a concrete materialist approach to society and human action. So we seek the concrete happiness and the real emancipation of humanity. And this is why we fight for the socialist revolution, which is the only concrete way to achieve this goal. And so from this perspective, we defend the interests of the working class, which is uniquely positioned due to its role in the production and its number to paralyze the economy and overthrow the capitalist order. It is in this class, that lies the full revolutionary potential of the future of a classless society, a society that is freed from the yoke of exploitation. And actually, when you look at it, the working class already has a morality. Even though, bourgeois morality dominates in society and influences the workers, of course, in periods of intense class struggle, we also see a different kind of morality. When the workers go on strike, when they go in mass movements, the great principles of human solidarity are completely swept aside. And they are replaced, by a concrete working class solidarity and a hatred for the bosses. That's something very concrete. And so we can say that there's sort of a morality of the picket lines, which I think is way more stronger and deeply felt because it has a clear class content. And so communists, we base ourselves on the highest, the clearest, the strongest form of this proletarian morality and this class consciousness. And Trotsky explained that for communists, is morally good what serves to, and I quote, unite the revolutionary proletariat, fill their hearts with irreconcilable austerity to repression, teach them contempt for official morality in its democratic eco-wars, imbue them with consciousness of their own historical mission, raise their courage and spirit of self-sacrifice in the struggle. If you read this, and this means, as Trotsky will also explain, that moral questions for revolutionaries are fused with questions of strategy and tactics, and obviously they're also informed by our theory and the experience of the labor movement. So, speaking of strategy and tactics, one question that we are often asked is, do Marxists advocate violence? And the question of violence is often posed in a very abstract theoretical question. You have the pacifists, for example, that would oppose violence in general, regardless of any context. But Marxists, however, we consider the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. And the reality is that violence and war are parts of the foundation of capitalism. And of course, the capitalist class, they have many weapons at their disposal. But in the end, when the struggle between nation and classes reach its highest point, naked force will prevail. The bourgeoisie need violence because capitalism is based on class antagonism, with the ruling class seeking to maintain the workers' exploitation. And there are also, of course, antagonism between different factions of the bourgeoisie represented by their nation states. Look at the Middle East right now. Look at what this system has brought to the people in the Middle East. Look at what it is bringing to Iran, to Lebanon, to Palestine. It is clear this system is violent. And now just look at the budgets of the police, the army. With just a fraction of what the imperialist powers invest in war and violence, we would eradicate hunger and poverty worldwide. But this will never happen under capitalism. As long as the system exists, violence will be part of our life. And so communists were fighting against this very concrete violence. That's why we fight to overthrow capitalism. And now the question on violence in a revolutionary, struggle becomes a very concrete question. Violence becomes very concrete. It is very concrete at the moment in the streets of Kashmir, as it was, in the Gen Z revolution and in the revolutionary wave we've seen in the last period. And there's one example in particular that I think can help us understand our approach and our position, is the example of Sudan. In 2019, we had a huge and powerful revolutionary movement that overthrew the authoritarian regime of Omar al-Bashir. And when the regime fell, the military junta took its place, and the only way to rule was for them to use, brutal violence. And in this context, the only way for the masses to protect themselves, and also for the goals of the revolution to be achieved, would have been to arm the workers and the poor so that they could have fought and defeated the attacks of their counter-revolutionary forces. It was a matter of life or death for the revolution. But you see, the leadership of this movement, they were proud of using non-violent methods, so they refused to do so. And so this left the workers completely defenseless. They were beaten, raped, killed by the regime. And so ultimately, what we saw is that the leaders, they sacrificed the revolution on the altar of pacifism. And the consequences were extremely brutal. As comrades may know, since then, the country has been trapped in a bloody civil war. And this shows that pacifism is not only useless, but it is a cancer for a revolutionary movement. When you look at it, it has led to far greater violence than any kind of violence that the masses would have had to apply to smash the old regime. And this is a general law in history. The violence of counter-revolution, which is directed against the majority, is always far more brutal than the one that uses the masses to protect themselves against the exploiting minority. And so this question, communists were neither for or against violence in general, in the abstract. Our approach is based on the specific situation at hand. And for us, and I think that's very clear, very important, the violence used by the oppressors to keep his slave in chains is absolutely not the same as the violence used by the slaves to break those chains. The violence of the state of Israel is not the same of that of the Palestinians. And in fact, pacifism, it is a reflection of bourgeois morality, which, indeed advocates, pacifism in a completely hypocritical manner. But you can say that the pacifists, they take the bourgeoisie at its word when it speaks of peace. And so they end up giving them a cover, a moral cover, and adding credibility to their empty rhetoric. And in doing so, they end up placing the violence of the oppressed and the oppressor on equal footing. For that, I think the imperialists can be very happy. And what we see in the movement is that reformists often take this approach. They defend this same view, and they end up denouncing revolutionary violence. So we really can't fall in this trap, and we must have a clear approach on this. Now, if we do not have any abstract opposition to violence, does that mean that we advocate violence of any form as long as it, is directed at overthrowing capitalism? Of course, no, because the emancipation of humanity can only be achieved through a socialist revolution in which, the working class takes power. And so, But as I said before, this means that the only effective methods, tactics, are those that help unite and strengthen the working class and raise the consciousness of its role in society, as Trotsky explained. Which also mean that, in contrast, actions that brings division within the working class and therefore weakens it, or that keep workers in a state of passivity, are therefore harmful. On the 4th of December 2024, Luigi Mangione allegedly killed the CEO of the insurance company United Healthcare. It aroused enormous sympathy among people who regarded him as an hero, and it brought, to the surface the enormous class anger that was in the US. But it also raised an important question: are, assassinations and individual acts of terrorism effective means for overthrowing the system? Of course, communists, we have enormous sympathy for those who regard Luigi Mangione as a hero and that condemn, the hypocritical justice system, which defends, the murder of thousands by the ruling class. And we do not raise abstract moral objection to the actions of Mangione and others. But, there's always a but, we do question their effectiveness. The first thing is that after, the sensation caused by the assassination, US capitalism, of course, remained intact. CEOs, politicians, individuals, they can be replaced. And the US healthcare system continues to condemn thousands to bankruptcy and premature death. But I think there's a bigger issue with what we call, individual terrorism. And what history has shown us is that individual terrorism or, guerrilla methods, when they are alone and divorced from the class struggle, they tend to have the opposite effect to that which was intended. They substitute the actions of a minority or even just of an individual for the collective action of the working class. They do not strengthen its unity or level of organization, nor do they strengthen the workers' beliefs in their ability to overthrow capitalism. Where, while there has been, a lot of support for Luigi, just as we have often seen, support for individual act of terrorism throughout history, narodniks like Zazulich, they got a moment of fame. But we need to recognize that it's still a passive form of support. This kind of tactics, it sends the message to the workers that they should rely on committed individuals to fight in their place. But it is precisely the opposite message that we need to convey. And you see, that's what we saw. If you go online, and even when you hear people have been writing, stuff like, oh, we need another Luigi. We need another courageous individual. And in addition to this, I think these methods, they tend to reinforce the repressive apparatus of the states, which will adopt, harsher methods to deal with the so-called terrorists. So no matter the genuine intentions of the people, these methods tend to reinforce and strengthen, the force of the bourgeois violence, without at the same time, creating powerful organizations of the working class to resist those attacks. But under certain conditions, Marxists, we could support, individual acts of violence or sabotage, direct actions, if they are linked to the revolutionary struggle of the working class, and it helps this struggle. So for example, you have a context of the revolution, the civil war, the assassination of, a fascist gang leader or a reactionary army officials, it would be justified. But if you were to do this, in the absence of revolutionary movement, it would certainly have the opposite effect. That's why, unfortunately, if you're looking for a cookbook, how to behave as a Marxist, how not to behave, well, I can't give you that. Only sectarians, you could probably see, they can give you this, ready-made abstract formulas. But no, we cannot say in advance, in the abstract, what tactics are not permissible at any given moment. It needs to be concrete. Only, I would say, the living experience of the labor movement and the struggle, with the help of theory, can answer those questions. Now I want to come back to Luigi Mangione, because I think there's something very important that his example revealed, that consciousness is changing. Think about it. While the ruling class condemned political violence, there can be no political violence in the society. People didn't buy it. A lot of people were rather condemning the system and the people who makes billions of dollars from debt of ordinary people whose insurance claim, are denied. I think it reveals that there's already a rejection to some extent of bourgeois morality amongst a sizable layer of the masses. And already before Luigi Mangione in the US, we had the incredible Black Lives Movement in 2020, where 54% of Americans in one poll thought that burning down the Minneapolis police precinct was justified after the murder of George Floyd. And I'm not even talking about the fantastic movement in Minneapolis we saw this year. And we also seen a very clear shift in consciousness with the Palestine movement. This is crazy. Look at all the way the ruling class and the media, they have put in all countries, to defend Israel and condemn and repress the Palestine solidarity movement. Despite its depiction at, its so-called anti-Semitism and its violence, the movement has grown, has become very huge. Millions of people have seen the truth beyond the smear campaign, beyond this bullshit. And in fact, government support for Israel has become a major source of their unpopularity, particularly among the youth. Now think about the impact on consciousness of, the war with Iran is having, the Epstein files, even the FIFA's World Cup is enraging people. I think that the stinking hypocrisy of the ruling class is being recognized on a mass scale all over the world. I think this shows that morality, that is a weapon of the ruling class, is becoming more and more a threat to its master. And as we've seen in history, this has serious revolutionary implications. And since with Luigi Mangione, we have witnessed other examples of individual action of anger against the unjust system. In an act of despair last April, Shamel Abdul Karim filmed himself setting on fire the warehouse of the company he was working in California. This worker that was pushed to the limit explained his action by saying, "All you had to do was pay us enough to live." And his sentiments resonated deeply among so many people. And all of this, I think it is part of what Trotsky called the molecular process of revolution. And to a certain extent, I think that, similar to the popular support for the Narodniks with their acts of individual terrorism in Russia, which foreshadowed the coming revolutionary mass movement that would culminate in the October Revolution, the current mood is really a sign of the giant class struggle that lies ahead. Now, the last part of this presentation is, as you know, history, shows us that revolutionary movement, and all the more so revolutionary organization, have always been accused of being a moral danger to society. When the ruling class, when the Russian masses took power in Russia under the leadership of the Bolsheviks, they were demonized. There's probably nobody in history that has been more vilified than Lenin, Sometimes I feel I don't have enough creativity to think about all the lies and slanders that the ruling class can think about. And what we saw is that all over the world, communists have been hunted down. And after that, the horrors of Stalinism, which has absolutely nothing to do with communism, but yet it still provided a golden opportunity for the capitalists to attack the entire edifice of communism and throw even more mud at it. In 1938, Trotsky wrote his famous "Their Moral and Ours" in the context of the Moscow trials. Thousands of Bolsheviks and others, they were falsely accused by the Stalinist regime, or accused of being Trotskyists and fascist agents. Sometimes it was the same thing. And many were killed. And it is in this very context that Trotsky wrote about morality. But why? Well, you see, at the time you had petty bourgeois individual, I would say coward petty bourgeois individual, ranging from the reformists to the anarchists, who started invoking great abstract principles of morality to condemn communism as a bloc. They suddenly had discovered that it was immoral. But the truth is that they were too weak to resist the pressure from the ruling class. The Second World War was just around the corner. There was a wave of reaction in Europe, the rise of fascism. And you had many disillusioned, terrified leftists who turned to the right. And Trotsky talked about their, and I quote, impotence and confusion in the face of approaching reaction, which will lead many former socialists and supporters of the USSR to turn against Marxism in the class struggle. And they would just end up repeating, the capitalist propaganda. And still today, we hear the same slanders about communism from both the anarchists and the liberals. And talking about those people, Trotsky mentioned their effort at overcoming the feeling of their own inferiority through masquerading in the beard of a prophet. The morally superior petty bourgeois. And the petty bourgeoisie is caught between, the great antagonistic classes and is not capable of a moral and political independence. And it often ends up being a transmission belt for the dominant ideology of the capitalists into the labor movement. And things haven't changed since Trotsky's time. How many prominent left figures, probably comrades in each country we have example, how many people, were too afraid of saying, too much to defend Palestine in fear of being called anti-Semites by the ruling class? And we see this kind of capitulation all the time. I have a very good example for you. So at May Day this year in Montreal, in Quebec, a small group of activists showed up with a fake guillotine featuring a funny replica of a papier-mâché head of the labor minister of Quebec. You could maybe argue that it was a bit clumsy, but their goal was explicitly to draw attention to the violence of the system, particularly the one caused by the labor minister himself and its government. But very quickly, it caused a big frenzy in parliament and in the media. The entire capitalist establishment in the province condemned this extreme violence by the left. Believe it or not, the Montreal police even launched an investigation. You'd think the minister had died. And so what happened is that faced with the pressure, the only left-wing party in parliament, as well as the leaders of the main trade unions, they all condemned the so-called the extreme violence committed by the left. Instead of going on the offensive and saying where the violence really comes from under capitalism, as we did, by the way. It said, c'est le système qui est violent, it's a system that is violent, with the head of the minister. Instead of doing this, they were so afraid of being called violent themselves that they just capitulate, as if it would stop the ruling class from throwing mud at the left and the labor movement. It had never stopped and never will stop them. They will always find anything, any little details in papier-mâché or so to use it against the labor movement. But yet we see the reformist leaders and the trade unionists adopt the moralistic narrative of the ruling class, and they serve as a very good cover for their rule. It is because they have accepted capitalism, they have accepted its rule, and therefore they also accepted their morality. And by binding the labor movement to these hypocritical standards, they have shamefully disarmed and set up the labor movement for defeats countless times. In the recent years, the ruling class has also benefited from the adoption of a mentality of moral purity amongst much of the left. I think you know what I'm talking about. There's this real obsession with creating safe spaces, with this notion that any left-wing organization where immoral behavior have been observed, or supposedly observed, deserves nothing less than to be canceled and liquidated. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that. I think sometimes they spend more time on morality than in fighting for a better society. This is a complete moralistic dead end that comrades we really, really must reject. Now, the fact is that everywhere around us, there is constant pressure from the establishment, from the ruling class, from the establishment, on the revolutionaries to submit to the dominant morality and abide by the judgment of the so-called public opinion. Everywhere, we're being told that we should not be too extreme, you know? We need to be moderate. We shouldn't be loud. You know, in many places, we can't be revolutionaries, but, you know, be discreet, be quiet. After all, we live in a civilized society. No, there are standards of good behavior. We must not disturb peace and order. We shouldn't sell our paper as well. How annoying is that? That is very, disturbing, a piece of paper. Also, how come are we so aggressive? We want people to join us, and we ask people to join the Revolutionary Party. And also, how dare we ask for money? You see it constantly, in one way or another, we are being told by the reformists, by the miserable left sectarians, by the media, by X, by Y, and Z, that we shouldn't fight, that we shouldn't organize professionally to overthrow the system. And we haven't seen anything yet. We must mentally be prepared for that. Especially as Trump seems obsessed with communism now. We need to build a tough skin. Because the more the class struggles intensify, the more will come under attack. Real serious attacks. Our comrades in Gilgit-Baltistan, they know that. Because what we're building, comrades, is the fight for the most important struggle on earth. Therefore, communists, we must remain absolutely uncompromising, steadfast in the face of alien class ideas and pressures. And Trotsky said, and if there's one thing you should remember from this presentation, I think is the following: a revolutionary Marxist cannot begin to approach his historical mission without having broken morally from the bourgeois public opinion and its agencies in the proletariat. Comrades, we have a duty. We have a duty to defend the interests of the working class, to fight for a revolutionary program, and to build this international. And for that, we have the duty to resist from the pressure from the ruling class, the reformists, and the so-called left. I would say, remember what we fight for, but also remember what we fight against. Remember the sickness of the Epstein class, which is driving humanity toward catastrophe. We can't ever bend to their morals. We must defend ours at all times. It is not an easy task. It is very difficult to resist these pressures alone. But that is the point. We are not alone. Our strength comes from our organization, from the collective struggle and experience of Marxists all around the world and throughout history. And I want to address myself specifically to those who are watching us online. Join us in this struggle. Together we are stronger. It's only together that we are strong. And despite the horrors and lies produced by capitalism in decline, there is a growing movement for a new society that is building up. And that is to this movement that the communists dedicate their life. It's not an easy life. It can be, not always. It's not a game. But as Trotsky said, and I will give him the last words, to participate in this movement with open eyes and with intense will. Only this can give the highest moral satisfaction to a thinking being. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Hélène, for that excellent start to this discussion. For our online audience, we will be back with you in 20 minutes. All right. Welcome back, comrades. We have a packed discussion, so we need to.
Rating over time, there were sudden and sharp drops in his approval rating. But when those dips took place, they were not.
And this is our job, is to expose them and class.
Cameron, that was a very good discussion. Now it's time to wrap this up. There's been a few questions asked. There was one question about, more details about the question of individual terror in a revolutionary situation. It was quite a long question, asking more details and all of that. You see, I tried to get, yeah, so I was gonna say I don't have a lot of time. That's probably why I was speaking quickly. So yeah, and as I said, these questions are not questions that you can answer easily with abstract, ready-made answers. So I won't have time to really give it justice. But you can take example from the ruling class. Bribe me and we'll discuss it all night. That was a joke. Obviously, I have to specify it. No, there was a question, a comment asked, why does sexual violence happen amongst working class people in modern times? I think Comrade Marco touched on this and by saying that, society is a mess. The level of alienation in this capitalist system in decline is huge. We see a crisis with mental health problems everywhere. Domestic violence is rising. You have things like, the incel movement. Now, and the list goes on. This is a product of this crazy, disgusting system. And I think that there's one thing that happens when you have no control over your life, no control over your working conditions, over your wage, as is the case for the big majority of society. There are some individuals that would, try to get control over their lives by trying to get control over people, and I think that there's the root here of a lot of violence that we see in society. So, and it's not to excuse these behaviors, but it's to really understand how society is fucked up and also contradictory. A few weeks ago in Montreal, we had a shooting. This young man drove from a very small town in Alberta for days to come to Montreal. He was targeting the headquarters of Pornhub. Yes. And in the end, there were 2 people killed. And they found on him like a very long manifesto in which he was protesting against the system. The media even said that he was a communist because he quoted Marx, but he quoted so many people as well. But it was he talked about, protesting against the system. He talked about building a vanguard party, but it was also combined with the profound misogyny and transphobia. He was using all the, incel talking points. And, it is very contradictory, and we see violence, we see sexual violence in the working class. People are dispossessed from their labor and their living condition. This is exactly what alienation is. But one thing I would say that we should not forget the other side of the question. In the space of few years, we've seen gigantic steps that have been made, regarding the struggle for women, for LGBTQ emancipation, the fight against racism. In Canada, there's been the systematic oppression of Indigenous people since the foundation of the country. But in the space of few years, with revelations, the big scandals, you see that there's, a majority of people who are disgusted by what the state has done, and they want to fight against the real serious, tragic oppression of Indigenous people. So I think we are seeing a contradictory process in society at the moment. We see all the worst thing that class society brings, but we also see the best from what Ben described, this proletarian morality that is building up. And I think it's going to be like that for a while. But I think we see where things are going. Things are changing very quickly. There's much more to say, but I'll pass on another question I was asked is how can we strengthen comrades who are more sensitive, quote unquote, and struggle under pressure of the bourgeois morality. And I think this question is connected to every single aspect of what is Marxism, what is communism about. It also comes back to the understanding of what we are building and what we fight for. I think one thing that we really need is this sense of history. We're not the first one who are facing moral pressures and attacks. Of course. We had a talk on the Enlightenment earlier this week. Think about all those thinkers, all those people who fought in the name of truth against the established morality. Some of them, they died, they were killed because they were defending their ideas. And these ideas are the ideas that push forward the progress of humanity in many regards. We should think about this. We should think about all those who have fought before us and all the masses who have fought before us. One thing I would say is that you're not alone, comrade. Even when you're alone, you're not alone. You know, even if you're alone in front of for example, a crowd of reformists, you know, if you're intervening in a labor meeting, you have the party behind you. You have the ideas with you. You have the comrades who support you. And you know, we should see ourselves as part of this long struggle of revolutionaries fighting against the stream. Can you imagine them behind me at the moment? This is really the sense of history. And also, you know, I said fighting against the stream, but I think we should also, you know, acknowledge that we are advancing with the stream of history. We've discussed this in the world perspective, you know. We are part of history. We are really entering this fantastic period for communists. Just compare, you know, how difficult the conditions were, you know, when Ted Grant was building during the post-war boom. Compare this to what we have right now. There's never been a better time to be a communist and to fight against the moral of the ruling class. We are on the good side of history. And I think this can really help us in getting, you know, as we said, this tougher skin. And on top of that, I think we also need a very good sense of humor and sense of proportion. Because sometimes, you know, communists are like, oh, we're getting attacked. And then I've seen this. Some of the attacks against us are so lame. You know, you see comments online. So apparently communists, we all smell. At least in Canada, we all smell. They know that. I guess we're human beings. You know, in Canada, it's always the obsess on the Tim Hortons coffee cups, you know. Apparently communists, it's funny that communists drink coffee. They have nothing to say on our ideas. And I think we need a sense of perspective with that. Yesterday, actually, comrades showed me a video that a Stalinist, very reactionary, made about us, and I got an honorable mention personally in this. And he compared me with Fiona, not Fiona Lally, Fiona from Shrek. I bet he thought it was an insult, but honestly, I think it's a great compliment. She's a badass. But I think we need to, you know, they didn't have anything to say about our stuff, or they couldn't make an argument. And this makes me think about a very famous character in French literature. Maybe you know of Cyrano de Bergerac, the guy with the long nose. It's a very famous play, and there's a scene where a very noble man tried to mock his nose. And then he's like, doesn't say it like that, but you know, he says, "That's all you got?" And then he goes on with this long tirade, we call it la tirade du nez, to describe how all the various forms of insult, very clever insult he could have used. And he looked very, you know, much more smart than the other guy. And so all I'm saying is that we need to get a sense of proportion, and you know, we can mock this. Now I need to conclude. I was surprised that there was one question that I thought might have come up, But I'm sure some comrades or maybe people online have had this question. What about human nature? You know, you hear people say that, human nature is evil, that humans are fundamentally selfish, that it would be absolutely impossible to achieve a society of equality, freedom, and cooperation. Therefore, we can't achieve go to a socialist society. And obviously, if it was the case, how could we explain the countless examples of cooperation, generosity, solidarity that we see on a daily basis? And as I've mentioned before, and as we've discussed in other sessions, for a big majority of human history, cooperation has been central to practically, all human history in hunter-gatherer societies. But at the moment, there is this mood of pessimism, of demoralization, of skepticism, of cynicism that is spreading among people. And in fact, this is a symptom of capitalism in a deep crisis. And where this sentiment is the most visible is, I think, clearly on the left, where it seems everyone is depressed, among both the reformists and the so-called, revolutionary sectarians. I think there's this very short-sighted, very highly empiricist outlook, where they only seem to see what is immediately in front of them and on the surface of things. And I've seen this. There's petty bourgeois, activists who often get angry when we express our, confidence in the working class ability to change the course of history. You hear this? No, workers aren't revolutionaries. They're lazy, individualistic. This is the thing. They're bourgeoisified, I've heard. They vote for Trump. They're morally corrupt. And I think they view today's rotten society with its rotten ruling class as it was a reflection of the past, present, and future of humanity. And they are incapable of seeing things dialectically in their contradictions and process. And I think their contempt for the working class is also, or I would say, of course, accompanied by contempt for theory. Because the two, they always go hand in hand. We say, no, the working class is not morally corrupt. No human beings they're not fundamentally evil. There is really no human nature independent of the material conditions. But it is certain that in a society that is driven by exploitation and profit, yes, greed is a key virtue. It is like a jungle where the smaller ones get eaten by the bigger ones. So yes, selfishness is valued in this system. That is the class society that we must get rid of. We need to throw in the trash. And I think it was mentioned, but you see the solidarity and the cooperation of the working class in action every time workers go into struggle. And speaking of a sense of history, you look at this, the women's in the French revolutions, in the streets of Sudan. You see things that you would never normally see under capitalism. This shows us what's the future. And so the trust that the communists we have in the working class does not come from the belief that workers are just morally superior in every respect. No, and we don't need that. Because what we have is this long view of history, this dialectical understanding that really allows us to see beneath the surface of things, beneath the appearance of complete decay. And we can see really that there's another society, a socialist society, that is meant to be born. And we understand the role of the working class in making this happen. And so our trust, our optimism, it's not just blind, faith. It comes from the ideas that we understand, society that we understand. And, by transforming the material condition, we will be able to create a new humanity, free of exploitation and alienation. And this new humanity will build a new morality. I think we cannot say exactly how it's gonna look like, this new society. It will be up to the future generations to build it. But I think we do have now everything to be optimistic, every reason to be optimistic. And I know it has been already quoted this week, but it is a beautiful sentence. I think will end well this session. It's from Trotsky's Testament. Life is beautiful. Let the future generations cleanse it of all evils, oppression, and violence, and enjoy it to the full. Thank you.
Service did not stockpile the ventilators, masks, tests, or drugs to deal with the pandemic. Why should it? This is not a route to increased revenue. And there is no substantial difference between Trump and Biden about the health crisis, where 1,000 people a day are dying.
God damn, I need some coffee. I got water last time and I'm dying. I need coffee. Something. Maybe an energy drink. Whew. Maybe I just need more water. Maybe I'm just unmotivated from all this fish killing. It's like, you know what? Exterminate all the fish on the earth. You know what? When those are all out, just exterminate all these fish that are in this video game. Okay, you know what? When there's no more air to breathe, then, you know, we'll figure it out then. Anyway, I'll be right back.
48% of frontline workers remain ineligible for sick pay. Some 43 million Americans have lost their employee-sponsored health insurance. There are 10,000 bankruptcies a day, with perhaps two-thirds of them tied to exorbitant medical costs. Food banks are overrun with tens of thousands of desperate families. Roughly 10 to 14 million renter households, that's between 23 and 24 million people, were behind on their rent in September. That amounts to $12 to $17 billion in unpaid rent. And that figure is expected to rise to $34 billion in past due rent by January. Lifting of the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures will mean that millions of families, many destitute, will be tossed into the street. Hunger in U.S. households almost tripled between 2019 and August of this year, according to the Census Bureau and the Department of Agriculture. The proportion of American children who did not have enough to eat, the study found, is 14 times higher than it was last year. And a study by Columbia University found that since May, there are 8 million more Americans who can be classified as poor. Meanwhile, the 50 richest Americans hold as much wealth as half of the United States, while millennials, some 72 million people, have 4.6% of the U.S. wealth. Only one thing matters to the corporate state. It is not democracy. It is not truth. It is not the consent of the governed. It is not income inequality. It is not the surveillance state. It is not endless war. It is not jobs. It is not the climate crisis. It is the primacy of corporate power, which has extinguished our democracy, taken from us our most basic civil liberties, and left most of the working class in misery, and the increase and consolidation of its wealth and power. Trump and Biden are repugnant figures, doddering into old age with cognitive lapses and no moral cores. Is Trump more dangerous than Biden? Yes. Is Trump inepter and more dishonest? Yes. Is Trump more of a threat to the open society? Yes. But is Biden the solution? No. Biden cannot plausibly offer change. He can only offer more of the same. And most Americans do not want more of the same. The country's largest voting age bloc, the 100 million plus citizens who out of apathy or disgust do not vote, will once again stay home. This demoralization of the electorate is by design. In America, we are only permitted to vote against what we hate. Partisan media outlets set one group against another, a consumer version of what George Orwell in his novel 1984 called the 2 minutes of hate. Our opinions and prejudices are skillfully catered to and reinforced with the aid of a detailed digital analysis of our proclivities and habits, and then sold back to us. The result, as Matt Taibbi writes, is packaged anger just for you. The public is unable to speak across the manufactured divide. Politics, under the assault, is atrophied into a tawdry reality show centered on manufactured political personalities. Civic discourse has been poisoned by invective and lies. Power, meanwhile, is left unexamined and unchallenged. Political coverage is modeled, as Taibbi points out, on sports coverage. The sets look like the sets on Sunday NFL Countdown. The anchor is on one side. There are 4 commentators, 2 from each team. Graphics keep us updated on the score. Political identities are reduced to easily digestible stereotypes. Tactics, strategy, image, the monthly tallies of campaign contributions and polling are endlessly examined, while real political issues are ignored. It is, of course, the language and imagery of war. This kind of coverage masks the fact that on nearly all the major issues, the 2 ruling political parties are in complete agreement. The deregulation of the financial industry, trade agreements, the militarization of the police, and the Pentagon has transferred more than $7.4 billion in excess military gear and hardware to nearly 8,000 federal and state law enforcement agencies since 1990. The explosion in the prison population, deindustrialization, austerity, support for fracking and the fossil fuel industry, the endless wars in the Middle East, the bloated military budget, the control of elections and mass media by corporations, and the wholesale government surveillance of the population. And when the government watches you 24 hours a day, you cannot use the word liberty. This is the relationship of a master and a slave. All have bipartisan support. And for this reason, these issues are almost never discussed. The goal is to set demographic against demographic. The stoking of antagonism is not, however, news. It is entertainment, driven not by journalism but marketing strategies to increase viewership and corporate sponsors. News divisions are corporate revenue streams competing against other corporate revenue streams. The template for news, as Taibbi writes in his book, Hate Inc., the cover of which has Sean Hannity on one side and Rachel Maddow on the other, is the simplified morality play used in professional wrestling. There are only 2 real political positions in the United States. You love Trump or you hate him. But voting for Biden and the Democratic Party means you do vote for something. You vote to endorse the humiliation of courageous women such as Anita Hill, who confronted their abusers. You vote for the architects of the endless wars in the Middle East. You vote for the apartheid state of Israel. You vote for the wholesale surveillance of the public by government intelligence agencies and the abolition of due process and habeas corpus.
5 years ago, by the way.
You vote for austerity programs, including the destruction of welfare and cuts to Social Security. You vote for NAFTA, free trade deals, deindustrialization, a real decline in wages, the loss of hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs, and the offshoring of those jobs to underpaid workers who toil in sweatshops in countries such as Mexico, China, or Vietnam. You vote for the assault on teachers and public education and the transfer of federal funds to for-profit and Christian charter schools. You vote for the doubling of our prison population, the tripling and quadrupling of sentences, and the huge expansion of crimes meriting the death penalty. You vote for militarized police who gun down poor people, often of color, with impunity. You vote against the Green New Deal and immigration reform. You vote for the fracking industry. You vote for limiting a woman's right to abortion and reproductive rights. You vote for a segregated public school system in which the wealthy receive educational opportunities and poor people of color are denied a chance. You vote for punitive levels of student debt and the inability to free yourself of those debt obligations even if you file for bankruptcy. You vote for deregulating the banking industry and the abolition of Glass-Steagall. You vote for the for-profit insurance and pharmaceutical corporations and against universal health care. You vote for defense budgets that consume more than half of all discretionary spending. You vote for the use of unlimited oligarchic and corporate money to buy our elections. You vote for a politician who, during his time in the Senate, abjectly served the interests of MBNA, one of the largest independent credit card companies in the world, headquartered in Delaware, which also employed Biden's son, Hunter. Biden was one of the principal architects of the wars in the Middle East, where we have squandered upwards of $7 trillion and destroyed or extinguished the lives of millions of people. He is responsible for far more suffering and death at home and abroad than Trump. And if we had a functioning judicial and legislative system, Biden, along with the other architects of our disastrous imperial wars, corporate plundering of the country, and betrayal of the American working class, would be put on trial, not offered up as a solution to our political and economic debacle. The Democrats and their liberal apologists adopt tolerant positions on issues regarding race, religion, immigration, women's rights, and sexual identity, and pretend this is politics. But these issues are societal or ethical issues. They are important, but they are not social or political issues. The seizure of control of the economy by a class of global speculators and corporations has ruined the lives of the very groups the Democrats pretend to lift up. When Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party, for example, destroyed the old welfare system, 70% of the recipients were children. Those on the right of the political spectrum, and we must never forget that the positions of the Democratic Party would make it a far-right party in Europe, demonize those on the margins of society as scapegoats. Culture wars mask the reality. Both parties are full partners in the destruction of our democratic institutions. Both parties have reconfigured American society into a mafia state. It only depends on how you want it dressed up. The power of politicians such as Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Mitch McConnell comes from being able to funnel corporate money to anointed candidates. In a functioning political system, one not saturated with corporate cash, they would not hold power. They have transformed what the Roman philosopher Cicero called a commonwealth, a res publica, a public thing, or the property of a people, into an instrument of pillage and repression on behalf of a global corporate oligarchy. We are serfs ruled by the obscenely rich, omnipotent masters who loot the U.S. Treasury, pay little or no taxes, and have perverted the judiciary, the media, and the legislative branches of government to strip us of civil liberties and give them the freedom to engage in financial fraud and theft. In the midst of the pandemic, what did our ruling kleptocrats do? They looted $4 trillion on a scale unseen since the 2008 bailout overseen by Barack Obama and Biden. They gorged and enriched themselves at our expense while tossing crumbs out the windows of their private jets, yachts, penthouses, and palatial estates to the suffering and despised masses. The CARES Act handed trillions in funds or tax breaks to oil companies, the airline industry, which alone got $50 billion in stimulus money, the cruise ship industry, and gave a $170 billion windfall to the real estate industry. It handed subsidies to private equity firms, lobbying groups, whose political action committees have given some $200 million in campaign contributions to politicians in the last 2 decades, the meat industry, and corporations that have moved offshore to avoid paying U.S. taxes. The CARES Act allowed the largest corporations to gobble up money that was supposed to keep small businesses solvent to pay workers. It gave 80% of tax breaks under the stimulus package to millionaires and allowed the wealthiest to get stimulus checks that averaged $1.7 million. The CARES Act also authorized $454 billion for the Treasury Department's Exchange Stabilization Fund, a massive slush fund doled out by Trump cronies to corporations that, when leveraged 10-1, can be used to create a staggering $4.5 trillion in assets. The act authorized the Fed to give $1.5 trillion in loans to Wall Street, which no one expects will ever be repaid. American billionaires have gotten $434 billion richer since the pandemic. Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, whose corporation Amazon paid no federal taxes last year alone, added nearly $72 billion to his personal wealth since the pandemic started. And during this same period, 55 million Americans lost their jobs. Now, the molding of the public into warring factions works commercially. It works politically. It destroys, as it is designed to do, class solidarity. But it's also a recipe for social disintegration. It propels us towards the kind of Hobbesian world Primo Levi and Sigmund Freud warned us about. I watched competing ethnic groups in the former Yugoslavia retreat into antagonistic tribes. They seized rival mass media outlets and used them to spew lies, mythological narratives exalting themselves and their ethnic group, along with vitriol and hate against the ethnicities they demonized. This poisoned solidarity, which we are replicating, pumped out month after month in Yugoslavia, destroyed the capacity for empathy, perhaps the best definition of evil, and led to a savage fratricide. The United States, awash in military-grade weaponry, is already plagued by an epidemic of mass shootings. There are death threats against critics of Trump, including Representative Ilhan Omar. There was an aborted plot by 13 members of a right-wing militia group to kidnap the governors of Michigan and Virginia and start a civil war. A Trump supporter mailed pipe bombs to prominent Democrats and CNN, an effort to decapitate the hierarchy of the Democratic Party, as well as terrorize the media outlet that is the party's principal propaganda platform.
Yeah, cool solutions to cool
spark
problems, I guess.
that usually sets such tinder ablaze is martyrdom. Aaron J. Danielson, a supporter of the right-wing group Patriot Prayer, was wearing a loaded Glock pistol in a holster and had bear spray and an expandable metal baton when he was shot dead on August 29th, allegedly, by Michael Forrest Reinhold, a supporter of Antifa, in the streets of Portland. A woman in the crowd can be heard shouting after the shooting, "I am not sad that an effing fascist died tonight." Reinhold, was ambushed and killed by federal agents in Washington state in what appears to be an act of extrajudicial murder. Not that different from the state executions I covered in Argentina or El Salvador. Once people start being sacrificed for the cause, it takes little for demagogues to insist that self-preservation necessitates violence. Political stagnation and corruption, along with economic and social misery, spawn crisis cults, movements led by demagogues that prey on the unbearable psychological and financial distress and champion violence as a form of moral purification. These crisis cults, already well established among followers of the Christian right, right-wing militia groups, and many of those who back Donald Trump, who look at him not so much as a politician but as a cult leader, all peddle magical thinking and an infantilism that promises, if you surrender all autonomy, prosperity, restored national glory, a return to a mythical past, order, and security. For this reason, Trump is the symptom. He is not the disease. And if he leaves office, far more competent and dangerous demagogues will rise if the social conditions are not radically improved to take his place. I fear we are headed towards a Christianized fascism.
Yeah.
The greatest moral failing of the liberal church, which I come out of, was its refusal, justified in the name of tolerance and dialogue, to denounce the followers of the Christian right as heretics. By tolerating the intolerant, it ceded religious legitimacy to an array of con artists, charlatans, and demagogues, along with their cultish supporters. It stood by as the core gospel message, concern for the poor and the oppressed, was perverted into a magical world where God and Jesus showered believers with material wealth and power. The white race became God's chosen agent. Imperialism and war became divine instruments for purging the world of infidels and barbarians, evil itself. Capitalism, because God blessed the righteous with wealth and power and condemned the immoral to poverty and suffering, became shorn of its inherent cruelty and exploitation. The iconography and symbols of American nationalism became intertwined with the iconography and symbols of the Christian faith. The mega-pastors, narcissists, who rule despotic, cult-like fiefdoms, make millions of dollars by using this heretical belief system to prey on the despair and desperation of their congregations, victims of neoliberalism and deindustrialization. These believers find in Trump, who preyed on this despair in his casinos and through his sham university, and these megapastors, champions of the unfettered greed, cult of masculinity, lust for violence, white supremacy, bigotry, American chauvinism, religious intolerance, anger, racism, and conspiracy theories that are at the core of the Christian right. When I wrote my book, American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America, I was quite serious about the term fascist. Tens of millions of Americans live hermetically sealed inside the vast media and educational edifice erected by the Christian right. In this world, miracles are real. Satan, allied with liberal, secular humanists and the deep state, along with Muslims, immigrants, feminists, intellectuals, artists, and a host of other internal enemies, is seeking to destroy America. Trump is God's anointed vessel to build the Christian nation, and cement into place a government that instills biblical values. These biblical values include banning abortion, protecting the traditional family, turning the Ten Commandments into secular law, crushing infidels, especially Muslims, indoctrinating children in schools with biblical teachings, and thwarting sexual license, which includes any sexual relationship other than marriage between a man and a woman. Trump is routinely compared by evangelical leaders to the biblical King Cyrus, who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem and restored the Jews to the city. Trump has in fact filled his ideological void with Christian fascism. He has elevated members of the Christian right to prominent positions, including Mike Pence to the vice presidency, Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State, and Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. Ben Carson as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, William Barr as Attorney General, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and the televangelist Paula White for his faith.
WWE, WW whammy, like turn of events. Linda McMahon is now the Department of Education's whatever the head person is. That's who it is.
And Opportunities Initiative. More importantly, Trump has handed the Christian right veto and appointment power over key positions in government, especially in the federal courts. He has installed 133 district court judges out of 677 total, 50 appeals court judges out of 179 total, and 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices, and with Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, most likely 3 out of 9. This is 19% of the federal trial judges currently in service. Nearly all of the extremists, including Barrett, who make up the judicial appointees, have been rated as unqualified by the American Bar Association, the country's largest nonpartisan coalition of lawyers. Trump has adopted the Islamophobia of the Christian fascists. He has banned Muslim immigrants and rolled back civil rights legislation. He has made war on reproductive rights by restricting abortion and defunding Planned Parenthood. He has stripped away LGBTQ rights. He has ripped down the firewall between church and state by revoking the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits churches, which are tax exempt, from endorsing political candidates. His appointees, including Pence, Pompeo, and DeVos, throughout the government, routinely use biblical strictures to justify an array of policy decisions, including environmental deregulation, war, tax cuts, and the replacement of public schools with charter schools, an action that permits the transfer of federal election education funds to Christian schools. At the same time, the Christian right is building paramilitary organizations not only through ad hoc militias, but through mercenary groups of private contractors controlled by figures such as Eric Prince, the brother of Betsy DeVos and the former CEO of Blackwater. I studied ethics at Harvard Divinity School with James Luther Adams, who had been in Germany in 1935 and 1936. Adams witnessed the rise of the so-called German Christian church, which was pro-Nazi. He warned us about the disturbing parallels between the German Christian church and the Christian right. Adolf Hitler was, in the eyes of the German Christian church, a Volk Messiah, an instrument of God, a view similar to the one held today about Trump by many of his white evangelical supporters. Those demonized for Germany's economic collapse, especially Jews and communists, were agents of Satan. Fascism, Adams told us, always cloaked itself in a nation's most cherished symbols and rhetoric. And fascism would come to America, he said, not in the guise of stiff-armed, marching brown shirts and Nazi swastikas, but in mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance, the biblical sanctification of the state, and the sacralization of American militarism. Adams was the first person I heard label the extremists of the Christian right as fascists. And Adams warned us that liberals, as in Nazi Germany, were blind to the tragic dimension of history and radical evil, and they would not react until it was too late. Trump's legacy will, I fear, be the empowerment of the Christian fascists. They are what comes next. Noam Chomsky, for this reason, is right when he warns that Pence is far more dangerous than Trump. For decades, the Christian fascists have been organizing to take power. They have built infrastructures and organizations, including lobbying groups, schools, colleges, and law schools, as well as media platforms to prepare. They have seeded their cadre into positions of power. We on the left, meanwhile, have seen our institutions and organizations destroyed or corrupted by corporate power and been seduced by the boutique activism of identity politics. FRC Action, the legislative affiliate of the Family Research Council, already gives 245 members of Congress a 100% approval rating for supporting legislation that is backed by the Christian right. Christian fascism is an emotional life raft for tens of millions of Americans. It is impervious to science and verifiable fact. The Christian fascists by choice have severed themselves from rational thought and the secular society that almost destroyed them and their families and thrust them into deep despair. We will not placate or disarm this movement, bent on our destruction. By attempting to claim that we too have Christian values, this appeal only strengthens the legitimacy of Christian heretics and weakens our own. These dispossessed people will either be reintegrated into the economy and the society, and their shattered social bonds mended, or the movement will grow more virulent and more powerful. The Christian right is determined to keep the public focus on societal or ethical as opposed to economic issues. The corporate media, whether it supports or opposes the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, almost exclusively discusses her opposition to abortion and membership in People of Praise, a far-right Catholic sect that practices speaking in tongues. What our corporate masters, along with the Christian fascists, do not want examined is Barrett's subservience to corporate power, her hostility to workers, civil liberties, unions, and environmental regulations. And since the Democratic Party is beholden to the same donor class as the Republican Party, and since the media long ago substituted the culture wars for politics, the most ominous threat posed by Barrett and the Christian right is ignored. The road to despotism is always paved with righteousness. All fascist movements paper over their squalid belief systems with the veneer of morality. They mouth pieties about restoring law and order, right and wrong, the sanctity of life, civic and family virtues, patriotism and tradition to mask their dismantling of the open society and silencing and persecution of those who dissent. The Christian right awash in money from corporations that understand their true political intent will use any tool, no matter how devious, from right-wing armed militias to the invalidation of ballots, to block Biden and Democratic candidates from assuming office. Capitalism driven by the obsession to maximize profit and reduce the cost of labor by slashing workers' rights and wages is antithetical to the Christian gospel, as well as the Enlightenment ethic of Immanuel Kant. But capitalism in the hands of the Christian fascists has become sacralized in the form of the prosperity gospel, the belief that Jesus came to minister to our material needs, blessing believers with wealth and power. The prosperity gospel is an ideological cover for the slow-motion corporate coup d'etat. And this is why large corporations such as Tyson Foods, which places Christian right chaplains in its plants, Purdue, Walmart, and Sam's Warehouse, along with many other corporations, pour money into the movement and its institutions, such as Liberty University and Patrick Henry Law School. This is why corporations have given millions to groups such as the Judicial Crisis Network and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to campaign for Barrett's appointment to the court. Barrett has ruled to cheat gig workers out of overtime, greenlight fossil fuel extraction and pollution, gut Obamacare, and strip consumers of protection from corporate funds. Barrett, as a circuit court judge, heard at least 55 cases in which citizens challenged corporate abuse and fraud, and she ruled in favor of corporations 76% of the time. Our corporate masters do not care about abortion, gun rights, or the sanctity of marriage between a man and a woman. But like the German industrialists who backed the Nazi Party, they know that the Christian right will give an ideological veneer to ruthless corporate tyranny. These oligarchs view the Christian fascists the same way that German industrialists viewed the Nazis, as buffoons. They are aware that the Christian fascists will trash what is left of our anemic democracy and the ecosystem.
Yeah, they're trying to prop it up.
But they also know they will make huge profits in the process,
There we go.
and the rights of workers and citizens will be ruthlessly suppressed.
God dang.
If you are poor, if you lack proper medical care, if you are paid substandard wages,
That's why they're trying to poison
if you are
it.
trapped in poverty, if you are a victim of police violence,
Dang.
this is because, according to the prosperity gospel, you are not a good Christian. In this belief system, you deserve what you get.
Yeah, I mean,
There is nothing wrong, these homegrown fascists preach, with the structures or systems of power. Like all totalitarian movements, followers are seduced into calling for their own enslavement.
yeah.
As the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels understood, the best propaganda is that which, as it were, works invisibly, penetrates the whole of life, without the public having any knowledge of the propagandistic initiative.
What the F, man?
The tinder that could ignite violent conflagrations lies ominously stacked around us. It may be set off by Trump's defeat in the election.
Holy shit.
Millions of disenfranchised white Americans who see no way out of their economic and social misery,
Oh my God.
struggling with an emotional void, are seething
coming.
with rage against a corrupt ruling elite and bankrupt liberal class that betrayed them. They're tired of the political stagnation, grotesque, mounting social inequality, and the punishing fallout from the pandemic. Millions more alienated young men and women also locked out of the economy and with no realistic prospect for advancement or integration, gripped by the same emotional void, have harnessed their fury in the name of tearing down the governing structures and anti-fascism.
Wow.
These polarized extremes are inching closer and closer
Only two
to
takes
violence.
Two.
We have three options. Reform, which given the decay in the American body politic is impossible. Revolution or tyranny. If the corporate state is not overthrown, then America will soon become a naked police state where any opposition, however tepid, will be silenced with draconian censorship or force. Police in cities around the country have already thwarted the reporting by dozens of journalists covering the protests through physical force, arrests, tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray. This will become normalized. The huge social divides, often built around race, will be used by the Christian fascists to set neighbor against neighbor.
Yeah.
Armed Christian patriots will attack those groups blamed for social collapse, dissent, even nonviolent dissent, will become treason. Peter Drucker observed that Nazism succeeded not because people believed in its fantastic promises, but in spite of them. Nazi absurdities, he pointed out, had been witnessed by a hostile press, a hostile radio, a hostile cinema, a hostile church, and a hostile government which entirely pointed out the Nazi lies, the Nazi inconsistency, the unattainability of their promises, and the dangers and folly of their course. Nobody, he noted, would have been a Nazi if rational belief in the Nazi promises had been a prerequisite. The poet, playwright, and socialist revolutionary Ernst Toller, who was forced into exile and stripped of his citizenship when the Nazis took power in 1933, wrote in his autobiography, "The people are tired of reason, tired of thought and reflection. They ask, what has reason done in the last few years? What good have insights and knowledge done us?"
Yeah, for real.
After Toller committed suicide in 1939, W.H. Auden, in his poem in memory of Ernst Toller, wrote, "We are lived by powers we pretend to understand. They arrange our loves. It is they who direct at the end the enemy bullet, the sickness, or even our hand. Once the internal enemies are purged from the nation, we are promised America will recover its lost glory, except that once one enemy is obliterated, another takes its place.
Create some enemies.
Crisis cults require a steady escalation of conflict and a steady stream of victims. Every new crisis becomes more urgent and more extreme than the last. This is what made the war in the former Yugoslavia inevitable. Once one stage of conflict reaches a crescendo, it loses its efficacy. It must be replaced by ever more brutal and deadly confrontations. It is what Ernst Jünger called a feast of death. These crisis cults, as Drucker understood, are irrational and schizophrenic. They have no coherent ideology. They turn morality upside down. They appeal exclusively to emotions. Burlesque and spectacle become politics. Depravity becomes morality. Atrocities and murder, as the federal marshals who wantonly gunned down the Antifa activists Michael Reinhold in Washington State Illustrated, becomes heroism. Crime and fraud become justice. Greed and nepotism become civic
I
virtues.
did not mean to go that early.
What these
Whatever.
crisis cults stand for today, they condemn tomorrow. There is only emotional consistency. At the height of the reign of terror on March 6, 1794, during the French Revolution, Maximilien Robespierre announced that the Committee for Public Safety now recognized the existence of God. The French revolutionaries, fanatical atheists who had desecrated churches and confiscated church property, murdered hundreds of priests, and forced another 30,000 into exile, instantly reversed themselves to send to the guillotine those who disparaged religion. In the end, exhausted by the moral confusion and internal contradictions, these crisis cults yearn only for self-annihilation.
Yep.
Our ruling elites will not
Jihad.
restore these ruptured
Already been
social bonds. They will not address the deep despair that grips America. They will not respond to the climate emergency. As the country unravels, they will reach for the familiar tools of state repression and the ideological prop provided by Christian fascism. It is up to us
No much.
to carry out sustained acts of nonviolent mass
Oh, I'm gonna
resistance
pee.
if we mobilize in large
No, we
and
gotta
small
read.
ways to
We don't have to
fight
do
for an
anything
open
about this. What are you
society,
talking about?
to create communities that, as Václav Havel wrote, live in truth. We hold out the possibility of pushing back against these crisis cults. We hold out the possibility of holding at bay the brutality that accompanies social upheaval, as well as slowing and disrupting the march towards ecocide. But this requires us to acknowledge that our systems of governance are incapable of being reformed. No one in power will save us. No one but us
Thank God. I'm
will
so
stand
glad
up
you
for the
did
vulnerable,
that.
the demonized, and the earth itself.
Oh, whoops.
All we do must have the single aim of crippling the power of the ruling elites in the hopes of new systems of governance that can implement the radical reforms to save us and the world. The most difficult existential dilemma we face
Communism shit, you give me
is
fish,
to at
bro. I
once
see how it goes.
acknowledge the bleakness
No, I
before
see
us
you,
and
Epstein
act,
Clash.
to refuse to succumb to cynicism and despair. And we will only do this through faith, the faith that the good draws to it the
How much
good,
does that cost?
that all acts that nurture and protect life have an intrinsic power, even if the empirical evidence shows that things are getting worse. We will find our own freedom, our autonomy, our meaning,
Cool.
and our social bonds among those who also resist. And this will allow us to endure and maybe even triumph. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Volk Island.
So, Chris, what would you like from a question period? Do you want to invite people to
Sure.
submit questions?
Sure.
Okay. So we're inviting people to submit questions. Are you ready for a
I'm ready.
first one? So you were on Jimmy Dore, and this person who was viewing said, you mentioned the global elite are hollowing out democratic institutions
Oh,
right down to
he's so
public
bad.
education. So this is a
1 second. Oh my god. Well, that was a cool pickup. I don't know if I need to keep any of this on my body. But why not? Let's also bring this. Alright. Gotta pee. was that, DJR? Okay. This is the closest shit. Oh, whoops. Yeah, probably. Do we need any kind of gloves? I don't give a fuck. Learn the hard way. Who cares? Who cares? Alright, wait. History. Wait, of course it exited out somehow. Hold on. I see what's going on here. I've been hacked. Clearly. Let's see. I don't know how I fucked it up, but we'll get back to it in a second.
So this is a reference to a specific Jimmy Dore interview. As the only parent to stop a school closing and the creator of the film We Have Your Kids, and I guess in general, families and parents, what can parents do to resist the industry's looting of education, such as the fact that they loot 1,600 schools a year?
Well, I think the most important campaign is to fight against charter schools, because charter schools, many of which are for-profit, come with an array of tools, including breaking teachers' unions, that are very useful to the corporate state. They oftentimes focus exclusively on STEM and marginalize or don't even teach the humanities. And I think the assault on public education, and let's not forget that Arne Duncan, who was Obama's Secretary of Education, was a huge proponent of charter schools, is one of the most important assaults against our democracy. Our public school system was, in many ways, the crown jewel of our democracy. And its destruction through underfunding, through the attacks. I live in New Jersey, and Chris Christie made open war against the teachers' unions. I mean, the thing about charter schools is I live in Princeton, and we have one, and no one in the community wants it. It's decided as a state level, and it siphons off money from the public school system. Charter schools, in essence, are a form of educational apartheid because they can select the students they want. So they don't tend to take students at a low income level. They don't take students with special needs, and they don't take students who need English as a second language, because these are the most expensive students to educate. So I would say certainly stand behind teachers' unions, fight against ballot initiatives that seek to either cut or not to increase budgets for public school systems, and mount vigorous campaigns against charter schools.
So this one is about collapse in community. And this person writes, I live in one of the whitest counties in California. Our voter demographics recently tipped to Democrat, but historically it has been staunchly conservative Republican. I don't know how many people consider themselves third party or progressive. The towns in the county were established during the gold rush with the timber industries and agriculture. In the 1960s, swaths of people came out of Berkeley during the Back to Land movement, inspired by Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, establishing communes, spiritual retreats. We've been able to maintain a congenial balance of good old boys and hippies. That's about the only culture that we have, and it's part of the mystique for Silicon Valley Bay Area retirees. As the American empire collapses, I worry that my community will be faced with assaults based on ideology and not race. At one of our BLM marches, which was met with violent white nationalists, it received honorable mention by Ted Cruz on the Senate floor. In calculating how to maneuver through this time, I wonder if it is better to stay local where there is easy accessibility to self-sustaining communities, or would an urban area be better and be the best bet based on the sheer numbers of people and what I perceive as easier access to mobilization?
Well, if you take Yugoslavia, I covered the war in Yugoslavia, so you had societal collapse, ultimately a savage fratricide. People who lived in urban areas had a much harder time surviving because when the state breaks down, or in our case, when the state is concerned only with servicing that group, that tiny cabal of global financial speculators at our expense, they're not, the state won't carry out its traditional role of providing basic social services to the citizenry. We see this now unfolding with the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is imperative upon us to build local structures that are in many ways self-sustaining, and that is going to include the issue of food. And in an urban area, it's just a lot harder. So my own experience, for instance, in the war in Yugoslavia, is that those who remained in urban areas had a much harder time surviving than those who were outside urban areas and were able to build successful collectives. That idea of a collective is key because you can't, in moments like that, go it alone. You depend on a small community. So I think it will be hard. I mean, these food deserts, which are already now sweeping across the country, at least in a rural environment, you have some capacity to grow your own food and to have alternative food sources, as opposed to the commercial food sources that are trucked, by agribusinesses across the country.
So this next one gets at some of the philosophical and religious history aspects of what you were saying. So the person writes in, do you feel that the prosperity gospel is an extension of the Calvinist ethic, a constant throughout American history that is just ramping up now, or do you see it as a very new thread specific to 20th century evangelicalism?
Well, that's a good question because, of course, Max Weber saw the prosperity gospel as a constant. I think there's an important difference. I mean, the prosperity gospel has always been with us, and it does come out of Calvinism. But you saw powerful socialist movements in the United States in the early 20th century, and it also gave rise to Rauschenbusch's The Social Gospel. And this alarmed the industrialists, so they began to fund, in a big way, Rockefeller and others, an alternative theological viewpoint to counter the social gospel, and this revolved around the prosperity gospel. It was given perhaps its earliest, most extreme form by Norman Vincent Peale in The Power of Positive Thinking, which, by the way, Peale, that's the church that Donald Trump went to the extent that his family went to church. But that was, yes, the prosperity gospel has always, I think, been a stain upon Christian theology, but it was massively promoted to counter Rauschenbusch and the social gospel, and then has been given, I think, its most perverted and frightening form by the Christian right. The difference between the past and the present, and this really happened around the late 70s, is that there was a switch by those who embrace the prosperity gospel among fundamentalists and evangelicals. I mean, traditionally, fundamentalists and evangelicals called on believers to remove themselves from the contaminants of secular society, and that included not engaging in politics. That changed in the 70s, in particular through a Christian right, rabid, racist, Rousas Rushdoony, who argued that Christians had to create the Christian society in order for Christ to return for the second coming. And that's when we began to see these movements. rise, Jerry Falwell and these figures, it also coincided with segregation. So many of these so-called Christian entities created Christian schools, which were a way to keep white children from having to be in classrooms with black children. And they received tremendous funding from corporations, because if your theological outlook or your ideological outlook is such that God will reward you if you are a good Christian, indeed make you wealthy, then you don't need unions, you don't need to challenge the system, you don't need to change regulations or laws or workers' protection. And so there's been tremendous infusion of money. I mentioned some of the corporations, Tyson, Purdue, and others. The Koch brothers is another one. Tremendous sums of money into this movement, because they are the perfect ideological cover for the most rapacious forms of capitalism. And we saw millions and millions of dollars handed over by corporations to support Barrett's nomination. So that's right. It's not, the prosperity gospel has been problematic and has been with us, but it has, I think, eclipsed within the evangelical movement all other belief systems. It used to be in the Baptist Church, for instance, although they were very narrow-minded on issues of homosexuality and abortion and stuff, they were often very politically left, very pro-union. And Southern Baptist Seminary, which used to be one of the great seminaries in the country, was really taken over by this movement, and the professors were purged. The professors who had a kind of conservative or narrow social outlook, but a more liberal political outlook, they were purged. It didn't matter whether they were against abortion or not. At this point now, this movement is so powerful and so entrenched that to defy it, I mean, you see it with these, once in a while there'll be an evangelical pastor who will stand up and attempt to challenge the ideology of the movement, and they're swiftly disappeared, in essence, from the movement, and their voice is crushed.
So this question is from Kathy online, who asks, this is happening as the result of the rise of the populist rise across the entire Western world, not only the US. Do you believe that this is a cleverly orchestrated strategy to depopulate the planet by the top 1% in order to save the environment and to avoid spending for pension and health care for an aging population?
Well, if you're talking about the rise of right-wing proto-fascists, you're right. Hungary, Poland, I was in Poland not long ago. Powerful forces in France around Marie Le Pen, within Germany. And I think it's the result of neoliberalism. It's the result of turning huge segments of your population into what the ruling oligarchs consider human refuse. I think the ruling elites are just so out of touch at this point. Remember, they don't live in the same country we live in. They live in a country, a writer for The New Yorker called Richistan. They don't fly commercial airlines. They're on $500 million yachts. They live on palatial estates. They're like, the elites who retreated into Versailles or the Forbidden City. And unfortunately, they have almost unchecked power, but also are woefully out of touch with the suffering and misery that's rippling across the country itself. You're asking, will they sacrifice? Yes, they already. There was an article in the Washington Post, I think it was yesterday, about how most people within the Trump administration have opted for herd immunity. What does that mean? It means that we won't attempt to control or check the pandemic. We'll just let it ripple through the population, with health experts estimate 2 million dead. And those who aren't killed, hopefully will have antibodies, and the capitalist system will get back into its old rhythms again. Yeah, they're perfectly willing to dispose of us, and certainly perfectly willing to dispose of people in the developing world. That's not particularly new. So yes, that they, they care only about their own, and the rest of us don't matter.
What do we do in the event that Trump successfully subverts the American government and establishes a dictatorship?
Well, all we can do is take to the streets, but any kind of protests, and I'm talking about nonviolent protests, will be met with lethal force at this point. We're certainly on the cusp of something very ugly, because even if Trump is removed from office, that's not going to solve our problem. That was kind of the nature of the talk. But also these right-wing armed militias will be green-lighted to carry out savage acts of violence incited by Trump and his supporters if they're pushed out of office. If he, in essence, establishes a dictatorship, and we're very close to that, at the same time, those of us who protest will become targets. So it's either scenario is pretty bleak.
I have a question I want to ask you, but I guess I'll put it in there because it goes along with what some people are writing in. I mean, you referenced Primo Levi. So I'm just curious, how did you, I don't know, did certain Holocaust writers, Holocaust survivors come to you as people to read, given what you had experienced as a war reporter, and realizing the mass horror there, when you see it firsthand in other forms, that, you know, it's not just abstract, that it can happen, and looking to somebody like Primo Levi for...
Well, the reason
how you write about
the reason I cited Primo Levi and Conrad, who I didn't quote, is that they both understood how fragile social systems are, and how when they collapse, we become, or we carry out acts that make us strangers to ourselves. That, as Primo Levi understood, the line between the victim and the victimizer is razor thin. He writes quite a bit about the Jewish head of the Lodz ghetto, who was a monster, and how when we are scrambling for survival, when we are convulsed by fear, when we don't know where our next meal is going to come from, when we face the possibility of imminent death, we act in ways that are driven by instinctual drives to survive. And I experienced that in war. Courage is never a constant in war. I was in the Sudan during a coup with another reporter from the Wall Street Journal, a very close friend of mine. We turned a corner. It was dark. By mistake, we came towards the presidential compound, and we heard in the dark all of the presidential guards flick the safeties off their automatic weapons to shoot. And the other reporter was a few paces in front of me, and I instinctually moved behind him so the bullets would go through him first. It wasn't even a thought. Fear does strange things to you. And I think Conrad in Heart of Darkness, and also in his short story, The Outpost of Progress, which is perhaps even more brutal than Heart of Darkness. He shows how that veneer of civility, this is another thing that Freud understood, once it falls away, exposes rapacious and frightening human behavior. And so I think that is an inevitable consequence of social disintegration. I saw it in the former Yugoslavia, I saw it in the Congo, saw it in El Salvador, and we're not immune from it. And I think part of coping with what's coming for us is understanding that, the consequences of that, and our own capacity to descend to that level. And I think when you understand it, and you understand your own capacity to engage in activity that is selfish and brutal, you have more of an ability to safeguard. If you think it won't happen to you and you're immune from it, then you're living in kind of a fool's paradise.
Well, thank you. The legal and political philosopher Roberto Unger states that social innovation in the use of investment capital can address systemic problems. You've talked about the importance of local and regional capitalism. If raised to scale, do you believe that social entrepreneurship can counteract the effects of capitalism in the corporate state, as well as meet the major challenges that you consistently mention with climate change, reintegrating people into the economy?
Not unless capital is heavily regulated. This is the lesson of history. And as I mentioned in the talk, the goals of capitalism has two goals: the maximization of profit and the reduction of the cost of production, which is an assault primarily against labor or automation. So if capitalism is not heavily regulated, there's nothing intrinsically within capitalism to stop it from commodifying everything. Human beings become commodities, the natural world becomes a commodity that it then exploits until exhaustion or collapse. This is Karl Polanyi and The Great Transformation writes about this. So I'm not in that sense an anti-capitalist in that I think capitalism appeals to a side of human nature, but it's a dark side of human nature. And unless it's heavily regulated and heavily constrained, it will destroy the society, and that's what it's done, not just to the United States, but to the global economy, because in fact we have no control over our own economy. It's been surrendered, which is why all they ever talk about are cultural issues like abortion, and because there's no way at this point that we can influence our own economic structures unless we build structures to remove ourselves from it. And that's the problem. Capitalism has essentially, through a series of judicial and legislative acts pushed by capitalists since the 1970s, been completely unfettered. They don't pay taxes, it's legalized fraud, they loot the US Treasury, they hollow the country out from the inside. I mean, one of the reasons that you see charter schools is that the federal government spends about $600 billion, I think, a year on education, and the hedge fund managers want it. I mean, Karl Marx writes about this, that in the late stages of an empire, capitalists begin to actually consume government spending or government structures that sustain capitalism itself. And that's precisely what we're seeing in terms of the arms industry, in terms of the privatization of intelligence. I mean, we have, I think 16 intelligence agencies, and 70% are done by private contractors like Bose Allen Hamilton, where Snowden worked. So we've lost control. And that has what first created a mafia economy and now has created a mafia state. So I don't put any hope in entrepreneurs. I put hope in heavy state intrusion to regulate and thwart the power of capital. But in fact, these big banks after 2008 have only become larger and consolidated power. But it really, it's be a massive breaking up of monopoly. I mean, and until we create an electoral system that's not dependent on corporate money, we're not going to have any change. But that's not going to happen because all of these figures achieved political office with the power through corporate money. And as soon as they finish their term in Congress, they go straight off to K Street for lucrative lobbying jobs. In the same with the Pentagon. All these generals go straight to Raytheon, and when they're not on Raytheon or Halliburton or somewhere else, they're on MSNBC telling us that we should start another war.
So, I mean, that leads into a few people asking, is there hope? Bernie, AOC, Kashmir Sawant, do we look for hope anywhere in the system?
Well, hope isn't going to come through the political system. Bernie failed us. He failed us in 2016 when hundreds of his delegates marched out of the appropriately named Wells Fargo Center in Philadelphia carrying Bernie signs chanting, what does democracy look like? This is what democracy looked like. Sanders missed his historical moment by not walking out with them. We're never going to build what he calls a political revolution in an election cycle. He spent the intervening 3 years dutifully serving Chuck Schumer, whose power comes because he's the water carrier of money from Wall Street to the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party burned him once again. Remember that a figure like Biden or a figure like Clinton, without corporate money, Bernie would have won. There were all sorts of other dirty tricks using the DNC, making sure that superdelegates, as long as he didn't get a plurality, as soon as you got to the second vote at the convention, Sanders was finished because the superdelegates who are appointed, who are all lobbyists or DNC members, you can't sit on the DNC unless you're a superdelegate, not allowing independents to vote in primaries, and much of Bernie's young base were not registered Democrats. So I think Sanders' failure to go after the Democratic Party made him kind of morally and temperamentally not equipped to lead this fight. And now, of course, he's running around telling us to vote for Biden, just as the last election he was running around telling us to vote for Clinton. And the Clinton administration turbocharged neoliberalism, and many of the issues, welfare, Glass-Steagall, deregulation of the FCC, which turned the airwaves over to roughly a half dozen major corporations. They control about 90% of what most Americans watch or listen to. The omnibus crime bill, which Biden was a major architect of, tripled and quadrupled sentences, including sentences that put people into prison for life for nonviolent crimes, drug crimes usually. The explosion of the prison population, now the largest in the world. 25% of the world's prison population. We're less than 5% of the world's population. All of this was done under the Democrats. So, and Bernie just would not go after the Democratic Party because he didn't want to pay the price. And I admit the price would have been severe. They would have mounted an aggressive and well-funded campaign to drive him out of his Senate seat in Vermont. He would no longer have seniority. He sits with the Democratic caucus. And he chose his career, I think, unfortunately, over the battle that has to be fought.
Okay, so this is a homegrown comment with something you may have heard before, which is that your talk was a bummer. That's how it begins. Your talk was a bummer. The left normally does take up the mantle of malcontentism or critique. Your analysis is certainly a politics of despair, but that's not at all what we hear from Trump. And if the pandemic weren't so bad, the Democrats would be chipper too. Do you think that's a barrier to your position?
Well, it's, as a writer, it's not my job to sell you hope. The country's awash in advertising and political messaging and Hollywood and, just about every medium is there to sell you hope. And in fact, I find that kind of false hope very disempowering. I think that, especially given the climate crisis, we have to recognize the emergency that it is. And we have no time left. Even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, we have so much baked into the system, as I mentioned, that it's unavoidable probably that we'll reach 450 parts per million, which is catastrophic. And the idea that we can adapt is as specious as the idea that climate change doesn't exist. The idea that we live in a functioning democracy, or that the Democratic Party itself functions as a party, is just a misreading of reality. And it is a bummer. I find no joy in it at all. But at the same time, if we allow ourselves to be self-deluded, we become utterly ineffectual. We have to make a very rational, cold, and correct an analysis of the forces arrayed against us if we're going to bring them down. And I also, am not going to get up and give talks about how we're inevitably going to win and build the socialist, I am a socialist, the socialist paradise, when it's not true. That's not my job as a writer. My job is to discern the truth, or as best I can, and lay it out, and call for action, because I believe in action, against, I would call them these forces of death. I don't think that's too extreme, to save ourselves. I speak as a father. I have children. And I'm not immune to that kind of despair, but I don't want that despair to overwhelm me and make me either cynical or complacent. In the end, that resistance becomes a moral imperative. I've often said that, I don't fight fascists because I'll win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. But we can't use the word hope if we don't act. And we have to act against the real centers of power, not imaginary centers of power.
I also wonder if, in your experience, you feel like reactions to the truth-telling that you're weaving in with writers and ways of looking at the reality that's on the ground, if it feels like it falls along class lines or lines in the social divide.
It does fall along class lines, but probably not the way you would expect, because it's primarily the privileged and educated classes who are least able to see. Privilege, especially white privilege, or especially white male privilege, is a form of blindness. That's what privilege is. Privilege blinds you. And I spent 20 years of my life in the developing world, in places like Gaza or Central America, struggling as best I could to understand what it meant to be a Palestinian in the world's largest open-air prison, or what it meant to be a Salvadoran or a Guatemalan at the height of the wars and the terror and death squads that were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. And I speak Spanish and I speak Arabic. But I learned that as a person of privilege, as hard as I tried to grasp that reality, there was always a divide. There was always an inability, because of my privilege, to fully understand. And as long as I honored that divide and recognized it, I could have very real relationships. I teach in a prison. My students in the prison, these are college courses, they are earning their BA degree through Rutgers, are far more attuned to the reality that I just laid out than students that I have taught at schools like Princeton, because their privilege blinds them. So there is a class divide, but the class divide is one that the supposedly best educated, or certainly those who come from elite educational institutions, are least able to see.
How are we feeling? So another couple of questions? Okay. This one is another fusion of several comments and discussion points that have been brought up, but and it evidently seems to come from people wanting to feel like in the wake of your writing impacting them, what do we do? You strongly described how close Trump is to declaring enforcing dictatorship. Isn't that a strong reason to vote for Biden, even if he is far from what we want? I'd rather have the military and structure sharing in the fight rather than just in the streets on our own. So there are a few comments and questions about that, and those seem to fall along the lines of what do we do?
Well, what we do is what Extinction Rebellion is doing, which is use mass, prolonged, nonviolent civil disobedience to begin to disrupt and shut the system down. There were a few years ago, 10,000 Spaniards surrounded the parliament. The Lebanese people marched through the streets of Beirut chanting Kuyan, Yani Kuyan, which means everyone. The whole system has to go. And our focus has to be against the ruling elites. The idea that Biden is going to make it better. I mean, it's Biden that created the mess. It's Obama that created the mess, elected with a mandate after the financial meltdown. And the first thing he did was embrace the banking industry and turn his back on the rest of us. Obama's assault on civil liberties, especially his misuse of the Espionage Act, was worse than George W. Bush. And the reason he picked Biden is because Biden's basically a Republican. His voting record is Republican. He was picked because he would appeal to the Republican. He had close ties with the segregationists. He goes all the way back as one of the opponents of busing. And he is completely beholden to the corporate oligarchy. I mean, the corporatists love him. They support him. That's why they're giving him all this money, because they hope that he will restore a kind of decorum and gravitas and to the presidency while they continue to disembowel the country and the earth. So I don't want to play their game. I haven't voted for a Democrat since